Hello, everyone, and welcome to our session on alternative working arrangements. I am pleased to have Mr. Huey Newsome here with me to discuss this wonderful opportunity as we move forward. My name is Miranda Vetter, and I will be our moderator for today. Today, we're going to be going over what has changed now with COVID-19 and how can we move forward in this type of work environment. So I'm going to hand it over to Mr. Huey Newsome to give us a brief introduction.
So one thing, I hope everybody can hear me. One thing that I will say is that, there are a couple of things, think about it from a high level. I like to always personalize things to, to my experience. We'll go through today is kind of a walkthrough of, the things that we as a county, things that we as a county experienced as we went from 0% remote to looking at what are some of the alternatives that can help us deal with the pandemic, the realities of certain organizations needing to face the public, obviously, or public safety organization, being government, and also, what are the interests and the concerns of the employees, as well as obviously what are the costs associated with doing any of these things. So I'm looking forward to a good conversation. But the context is, again, COVID really forced us to think about what do we want to be, where I would say that we were kind of stuck in the previous century, if you will, in the way we think about work environment. So I'm looking forward to a great conversation. Thank you, Miranda.
Thank you, Mr. Newsome. So starting there, we're going to first start out with what has changed, what's kind of going on as we've shifted into this paradigm where folks are working from home. We found a lot of positive things. First, Mercer surveyed 800 employers and found that 94% said that productivity was higher or the same than pre-pandemic. Additionally, organizations have found that they can reduce their overhead related to real estate and other costs. According to Forbes, we found that even prior to the pandemic, employers found an estimated $11,000 per employee savings per year just from working part-time. Additionally, there's other wonderful benefits, such as allowing employees the flexibility to create their own schedules and meet their professional and personal needs. Childcare is also a huge issue that has been addressed through the ability to work remotely. Now, it's not just all positives. We have also seen some challenges that have been arising through working from home. The first being that it's been more difficult to connect and mentor those remote workers who, especially those who've started their jobs during the pandemic. We've also heard sentiment of folks saying that they feel like they're working where they're living and having a difficult time separating those two. And then lastly, there are some more ambiguous effects. We're not quite sure still moving forward in the long term how this is going to affect our employees overall. Will this be positive due to the flexibility, or will this have more negative impacts due to burnout? So that being said, Mr. Newsome, we wanted to ask you a few questions regarding this. And as somebody who's leading a governmental agency, are there any other things that you've had to factor into your decisions when deciding to change your work schedules for your employees, and how have you balanced that?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I would say, obviously for us, culture is a huge driver here. We always look at the opposite end of the spectrum, if you will. You have government that tends to be laggard in adopting new cultures, versus, say, a technology company, a high-tech company that is kind of leading in terms of alternative work culture or environments, or an alternative work situation. And so culture is a huge part of it, plays a huge role here, right? So like we can sit and design, and this we'll go through the presentation and kind of talks through all the things that we went through, but culture is a bit ambiguous, right? Because you'd be surprised how few people are able to adapt to working remotely, hybrid remotely, fully remotely, because it causes them a It's a change, to, for lack of a better phrase, it's a change. And one thing that we experienced, when we went to remote, at the county, we went fully remote, like a lot of organizations did in response to the, when I say full remote, anybody that could, anybody that absolutely could not do their job, remotely had to come in, but otherwise everybody was expected to work from home. And we went through a process where people were still coming into the office, even though they were almost, banned from doing so. But the problem was, it was so ingrained, they did not feel comfortable being able to do work in their homes. It just didn't feel right. And so it was a cultural issue that was such a shock to county employees. I think culture is such an important point, on top of the more tangible issues that we'll talk about in the presentation today.
Yeah, thank you so much for that insightful response. It looks like we're getting some Q&As coming in already, which is wonderful. So I just wanted to remind folks that if you do have any questions, please make sure to use that option on your viewing screen to post questions for Mr. Newsome. It looks like folks are asking about some slides, so I just wanted to make sure that you folks can all see them. Hugh, are you able to see the slides?
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Okay, moving on. So from here, I think what we wanted to discuss next is this idea that we've been thrust into an opportunity for an amazing amount of pilot studies. We kind of went from folks like Forbes and whatnot publishing articles saying that this is a great thing and we should do it, to all of a sudden actually having to immerse ourselves into this new work schedule. And in order to do this, organizations and governmental agencies have had to make significant investments in order to meet the needs of their remote employees. So I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about the types of investments that you've had to, budget for and create in order for your employees to be able to work remotely.
This is a very good question. Obviously, a lot of our investment went into IT. One thing, and people, obviously the first thing that people think about is, okay, but everybody needs a laptop. You'd be unpleasantly surprised to know the number of people that were working with a desktop, working with a desktop at the county when the pandemic first hit. And so obviously we were able to utilize CARES money to do so. But we had a number of people, and definitely a log jam, if you will, to process the people that, assess what people needed to get laptops so they can work from home, and then get those processed. The other piece to it too that isn't as readily known is going to be your networking infrastructure. There were we had, because again, got back to culture and policy, we did not have we pretty much banned working remotely only in certain exceptional circumstances. And so to go from exceptional circumstances to 3,000 employees working remotely, or 90% of 3,000 employees working remotely, you got to do some serious network investing. And we had to do it, snap up a finger, in order to make sure the county operations were still monitored and maintained. And so because of that, the good news was that, again, we had the CARES money that was available to us. But the problem was that, again, we had to process that, put it in place, test it in such a short amount of time. And the way we did it was, we narrowed down county operations to absolute necessary. What is it? To make sure that very base level operations were monitored, overseen, and then we moved up, right? To make sure that our normal county operations that could be done remotely, then were executed remotely, and in order to give us some time to get the networking infrastructure and the upgrades necessary in place. And there are other things, I think, that every single operation, I can go into specifics about finance, but every single operation is going to require some investment. One thing we had to do, these things add up, but we had been relegated to paper approvals. Some documents were required to have paper approvals. And so there were some policy changes that had to take place so that we could move to DocuSign and PDF signatures and that sort of thing. So every single department had its own costs and its own process changes, own process changes that were required for us to move to remote work, and that all costs money and time.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Especially with these investments in things like networks, investments in laptops, those are all very costly. And so given that you folks have invested so much in this past year, do you feel like the county should continue to work in this way?
No, I think so. One thing that we're looking at, and I'm going to get into it going forward, right? We've kind of torn down the wall, so to speak, and pushed into the world of an alternative work setting. And so, the opportunity that's there, I think something that we were scared of before we were forced to think about it, and now that we've experienced it, it works well for some people, and plus the investment's already there. You've already put the investment in terms of dollars, in terms of knowledge, in terms of experience there. So now we're at a point where I think that we're more open to it now than we've ever been, and it does work for us. But we talk about dollars, their policy issues, their monitoring issues, hand up, but their monitoring issues that we are considering as well, that we have to put in place to make sure that we have the right policies in place, the right capabilities and management capabilities really in place, because managing people when everybody's in one spot is one thing. Managing people when everybody is, you need to go hop on a phone or hop on a Zoom to talk to them is totally different. And that's a skill that needs to be taught.
Thank you for that insight. I think that's a great segue actually into what we're just about to talk about on this slide in particular, is that not every department is necessarily ready to be able to work from home, especially at a full-time capacity. And then there's also a willingness component. And so what we're trying to demonstrate in this matrix on the right-hand side of the screen is this notion that, different departments might fall in different quadrants of this matrix. So some might be very ready and willing to transition and have working from home, whereas others might find that more difficult for various reasons. Some of that being that they need to work in person, or as you were mentioning, paper copies. I know there've been a lot of policy changes, but still that could be a challenge and, impact willingness. So that being said, did you find any specific indicators or insights as to which type of work or which type of departments might fall more into this high readiness, high willingness quadrant versus those that might fall into a lower willingness or lower readiness quadrant?
I think what we did if thinking about each of the axes separately, from a willingness standpoint, that was more of a qualitative. It's been more of a qualitative assessment. The readiness, we did almost immediately. What we did in the very beginning is we challenged each of the managers and the executive directors of different throughout the departments. We said, assess your operations and tell us on an individual level, which person, which function, which responsibility could be done remotely versus on site, which has to be done on site, right? And so what we call it we categorize almost every single employee in the county. We categorize those employees as either remote essential, and when I say essential, I'm going to be very careful. Every single job is essential, but when you're in a crisis and you're down to bare bones operations, what does that look like? So that's what I mean when I say essential. So remote essential versus on-site essential versus can be done. None crisis essential. I put it that way. And so that gave us, by looking at those numbers, from those surveys. They gave us an opportunity to kind of see which departments were quote unquote ready to be remote, because we did it over a progression of time. First, probably 2 weeks into the pandemic, we asked the question. Then, as laptops were distributed, as people move, give example, moving from paper operations to paper approvals to to DocuSign and electronic approvals, and making adaptations, we asked the question again. So you can progress from on-site, on-site and essential to remote essential, because the process has changed. We've migrated the process after those investments took place. So that's an example of us, trying to assess the readiness of a single department or a single business unit or a single division or function, if you will, the readiness of being able to move from, to be able to work remotely.
Thank you. Yes, that's a really great point, that there's a lot of different kinds of ways that we can sort of categorize this, and not to mention this really moves into our next slide, which is talking about the fact that when we talk about alternative work schedules or flexible work schedules, that can mean a lot of different things, right? There's a lot of different ways that we can be flexible for our employees. So this slide in particular is providing 5 out of many different ways that you can provide the ability for your employees to be flexible. So Flexi-Tour starts with, it's fixed times, but folks can come in, they can vary their time in and out. They still work 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, etc. But this, especially with the pandemic, provided folks kind of staggered start times. So you didn't have issues with everybody coming in and using the elevator at the same time, if they had to come in. There's the gliding schedule, which allows flexibility. Again, you're still working 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, but you can come in at 8 o'clock in the morning one day, and if there's something that happens in the afternoon, you want to come in earlier the next day, that is a possibility with that type of schedule. There are variable days where folks are able to kind of change the start and stop. They can work, they can vary their hours in a day. So one day they work 8 hours, next day they work 7, and then make up for that with 9. But they're still doing the 40 hours a week. And then there's other types of arrangements where they can have a variable week where, you need 80 hours for your biweekly pay period, but you might be working 30 of them in one week and then 50 of them in the next. So that being said, these different types of work schedules do provide employees with the opportunity to work during non-standard hours. And I know that as a government agency, you really are serving our residents, and our residents aren't necessarily working during, or maybe working during, normal standard hours, and have in the past found it difficult to make it to the SNAP office, in order to fill their paperwork during the 9 to 5. So do you see this at all as a possibility to increase hours or make services to your residents more flexible? Oh, sorry, you're on mute.
I'm on mute. My apologies. No, I strongly agree with this approach, and let me explain to you why. I always start with the business process, like what would work for my department, which is mostly administrative and back office, would not necessarily work for the treasurer's department, who has to collect from, directly from citizens, right? And so you need a menu, I think, to be able to manage now a number of different competing priorities as a department head or as a director. You have, the changing appetite of employees for flexibility, right? And there's a reality. We're still dealing with the pandemic. We're still dealing with the fact that childcare, for instance, is a reality that working parents have to deal with. We still have to serve the citizens in our situation. And so we have all these competing priorities. The best way to do that is to have a menu of options such as you see here, so that you can meet the needs of different departments, meet the needs of employees, and also meet the needs of residents. And so we can go through and kind of pros and cons each of these. These are great. This is a great menu of options. but you really need to sit down and assess your business operations and say, okay, fine, what works for us. And that's, as long as you have responsible employees, they should be a part of that conversation. That's the hard part, right? Making sure that employees, some employees are very responsible and very open, and you can have this conversation with them to really assess and understand what could work for employees versus what you don't. You also have to protect yourself, obviously, against manipulation. That's the reason I'm going that route. But I think each of these could work. There is no right or wrong answer here, but it's going to change department by department by department, and maybe even groups within the department. Like we have accounting, we have accounts payable within accounting. Accounts payable, every 2 weeks we know that those paychecks. I'm sorry, not the paychecks. Every 2 weeks we know that those vendors have to get paid. Those checks have to go out. So that's one thing that you have to be thinking about. But for my central accounting team, it's more focused on, okay, we got to ramp up for the audit. It might not be the same. We're not running in 2 week cycles. We're getting trainings ready, and we're getting documentation ready. We're getting policies ready so that we can get ready for an audit that's going to take place in 3 months, 6 months. So it's a different story for them. And so I think, it really does vary, but it's the most fundamental thing you have to do is really be in tune what's your business function and what needs to happen for your residents. Your interactions with other departments, the dependencies within departments is critical as well.
Absolutely. So if I'm hearing correctly, it sounds like, moving forward, you might even consider, kind of mixing and matching these different menu options depending on the department, their needs, and the needs of the residents.
That's an excellent point. Because it's mixing and matching within, you could even mix and match as time goes on. You can be in a certain season where you want flexibility. Like for instance, my budget team, we've been working, 70, 80 hours a week. And so does it make sense for us to have a stringent, rigid, okay, you're going to be in the office from 8 to 6, Monday through Friday, but yet we're working till 10 o'clock at night over the weekend? Maybe it's 100% flexi-tour. Maybe it's 100% variable week. But because this is the height of the time this is the height of us developing the budget. But 6 months from now, when we're more supporting audit, or we're just dealing with making sure that we're able to close the months out, and it's more of a routine exercise, but we still have to engage with departments more readily as opposed to working in a bit of a silo, if you will, to get the budget developed. Is that a situation where one of these options works at one period of the year, but it doesn't work another period of the year? So it does vary, but you're exactly right. We have to be able to understand, assess, look at what's going on around us, and then really understand where we are, and maybe even it's good at one point of the year where it isn't at another time of the year.
That being said, have you, in your experience in trying to react to the pandemic, could you share some maybe best practices or even lessons learned as you're trying to help your employees transition to new types of work schedules?
I think some of the lessons learned that we experienced. I think the first thing is don't let a pandemic catch you off guard. Hindsight's 2020 here, but we were in a process, and we're struggling through this process. We were in a process of moving to a more, being laggards, going from being laggards to being leaders, or at least catching up and doing an ERP upgrade. And so the pandemic hit. You'd want your technology to be up to speed and not have a decades old ERP system, because in my mind, technology is kind of the fundamental component of how you'd work remotely on top of doing other things, right? You've got mountains and mountains of paper because you've got an old system. and because of that, you can't go remote. There are a lot of other reasons why you want to make sure that you have up-to-date technology. But I think that's one of the biggest lessons learned is there are a lot of different reasons why you want to maintain technological upgrades and make sure that you're not just from a standpoint of working remotely or dealing with a pandemic. There's a lot of different reasons to make sure that you're up to speed on your technology. So I think that's one of the major lessons learned. The second lesson learned is really understand what your employees are doing and be able to assess your business operations. For me, we started our shutdown when when I was 6 weeks into the job. And I really didn't understand what everybody was doing at the time. And so, obviously it's not a great time to learn what everybody is doing, but you really make sure that each of your directors understands at a high level what their employees are doing and what the day by day and week by week output should be, because managing remotely is super important. If you don't understand what's happening on a day by day or week by week standpoint with your employees, it's going to be very difficult to hold them accountable, right? You got good employees, you got bad employees. How are you gonna? Because you're not going to be able to walk over Susie's desk and say, Susie, are you working versus are you sleeping, right? Because Susie's going to be at home working or sleeping. So you at least have to be able to make sure that you're holding Susie accountable. And how the best way to do that is to really assess and understand what she's doing. But there again, it's a lot of different reasons to understand your business processes, the inputs, the outputs, and dependencies, so that when something like a pandemic or something else or technological upgrade, anything else happens, you are better prepared. I always say business process first.
So there are clearly a lot of factors at play here, and I think this leaves a lot of us thinking, what's next? As we try to move forward post-pandemic and everything, there's a lot of different factors that both you mentioned and other things as well. Some employees are looking for this. So when you're looking for talent attraction and retention, we already mentioned real estate costs, but there's also the balance of economic activity where your organization or governmental agency is located. Are folks coming in and eating lunch at the shop downstairs, or are they staying home? And again, this idea of collaboration and struggling without that human connection in person. So I guess in terms of where do we go from here? There's a lot of different questions, and I think we might switch over to some of the Q&A that's been coming in, and I think they really are trying to ask some of these things as well. So the first question that we have from the audience is handling employee internet costs and capabilities. So this we know is a struggle across the nation. Did the county decide to cover some of these costs, and what was the logic kind of behind that?
We were fortunate in that we got quite a bit. Let me make sure I understand the question. Is the question more geared towards real estate, or is the question more geared towards transitional costs like networking, et cetera?
I think it is a question of, and an audience, please correct me if this is wrong. Some companies decided to provide like an extra stipend or something for internet, just because they would be using their personal internet more. So just how did you kind of think through that extra cost that has been added to employees?
That's a great question. And, we were blessed with the CARES Act money, which really helped us provide that support to employees, making sure that the employees had what they needed and didn't have to bear an additional cost. So we were able to utilize CARES Act money. Not every municipality was able to do that. Large municipalities were able to do that. And my understanding is, obviously the ARPA money for recovery is retroactive, I believe, to the beginning of the pandemic. So communities that didn't get CARES Act money, that chose to give some sort of support to their employees to work remotely, get internet, buy a laptop, those sorts of things. I believe ARPA money or CARES money could have been used for it. That's what we used. Obviously, if there's a cost that you could not push on to CARES money or to ARPA money because you didn't receive it, but you still have to continue on. I think that's a sacrifice that almost has to be made.
Yeah, that makes total sense. The next question we have from the audience here is around kind of these virtual meetings. So understanding that virtual meetings might not be as effective. Some people might be multitasking. There's always some kind of glitch with the internet. So what are your thoughts around virtual meetings as we move forward, or will people have to come in just for meetings?
Yeah, well, that's a good point because even I, today working remotely was rushing and trying to get to the office for for a particular meeting. I think that it's what I found is that everyone, and hoping I'm answering the question properly, I think everyone kind of has to assess meeting effectiveness, right? I always think about meaning effectiveness and the fact that we all know that most communication is nonverbal. And there's a lot to be lost when you don't have that face to face. The most effective way to communicate is if we're in the same space versus over Zoom when I can, put the phone on mute or turn the camera off, see my face, that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of things that are missed. So, what we've tried to do, and as we're still working and finalizing with all these considerations there in the slides, we're still working and finalizing what our remote policy is going to be for the next 2, 3, 4 years to get out of the pandemic. And one thing we're trying to do is make sure that we, within a certain confine, have enough face-to-face meetings, especially for certain meetings, so that we don't lose that nonverbal aspect of it, and certain things are lost, and when, like I just described.
Yeah, absolutely. This next question is more so on cost. I'm not quite sure, given that there were some mixed telework environments, do you have an estimate of how much government money has really been saved by folks not coming into the office? And is this a driving factor moving forward as we decide whether or not we should stay on a telework environment?
Well, in terms of savings, the problem with that assessment is that for the most part, most of your spatial, in the short term, most of your spatial costs are going to be fixed, right? And it's not like an operational cost where, okay, people are working remotely, so I'm not going to need less paper, right? Or utilities are going to go down. So assessment could be done for utilities, I guess, but from a capital cost, have we saved money? I think that's more of a long-term assessment of is there certain capital that we can, that because we're working remotely, because we've broken down this wall to working remotely, psychological barrier, can we now reduce our spatial footprint and then from there save on rent or get the benefit of a capital outlay, of a capital inflow of selling a building that we no longer would need? And I think that's a complicated question, and we're not quite ready. I don't think we're quite there ready to answer that question yet. But once everything kind of settles and some final decisions are made, I think that the county will see some significant benefit from being able to do this.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Questions are also coming in about this idea of adapting to a shorter work week. Do you feel like this is going to lead to more folks working maybe a 4 days a week, but longer hours? Or do you feel like because of the nature of the work, given that you serve residents, that you need to kind of still have services 5 days a week?
I think what's going to end up happening is because of the demands of on county operations by residents, and rightfully so. We're here to serve the residents. I don't think that you're going to reduce that 5 day a week access, but I will say I think that the nature might change, where as residents show an interest and less concerned about being able to physically go to a window, and then less traditional, more technologically advanced ways of engaging with it. So, like for instance, instead of me going to the register of deeds and giving him a piece of paper or getting a piece of paper, can that transaction be done online? Well, that changes the nature of it. Does it mean that I have to staff a window at the register of deeds 5 days a week? Maybe not, but then I might need to bring other people in to monitor traffic, through the weekend, et cetera, something to that nature. So, those are the questions I think that that working remotely is not, we're not the only ones, others are as well. We're not the only ones that are asking these questions. And so get to a point where I think that it'll be transformative. It'll change instead of reduce the hours necessary to support the public.
Absolutely. Just looking through our list, there are some really great questions still. One being with regard to kind of bad actors. We understand that there will always be folks that, won't do their work as they're supposed to. So what are you doing to support your managers in monitoring their staff?
Well, let me tell you the wrong answer. The wrong answer, we started to try to look at mechanisms to monitor traffic, right? So how often are people sending emails and going through VPN and that sort of thing? And that really did not work for us. And the reason it didn't is because we ran into situations where we get false positives or false negatives, I guess is the right way to say it, in terms of people not logging in because they were going to a training or something. We didn't understand the day-to-day nature of the job, and because we didn't understand the day-to-day nature of the job, there were things that were happening, and we could not really use that monitoring to help us understand it. It really boils down to understanding what your employees are doing. It's so fundamental, and it seems kind of common sense, but it really is fundamental in being able to understand what's going on, because the best way to monitor an employee is just to make sure you understand what the day-to-day and weekly inputs and outputs are. Trying to use other things as proxies has limited, and it provides limited results.
Understandable. And if you have time for this one last question, there is a question regarding, what is your response to those who say that working from home is just a day off?
Yeah, I'm the type of person that has been able to, I've spent a lot of my career in management consulting, so I spent a lot of time on the road. I also spent a lot of time working from home, and there is a way to make that happen, where to make it happen where you can be effective and you can effectively manage to effectiveness remotely. It's a skill that I think we're a bit behind in trying to teach everyone what that looks like, but it's definitely doable. So
Great. Wonderful. And I guess, in your opinion, do you think that flexible work arrangements are here to stay forever?
yes, absolutely. There's no question. I think that there's no question that that's going to be the case.
And, besides, as we do this, as we transition, as we make this more permanent, what are the things that we should be providing to employees to support them in this, besides just, laptops, etc.?
I think the most, and this is something I'm quite passionate about, I think the most important thing that you can do, I think the most important thing that you can do is to make sure that the employees have, and make sure the managers have the skills necessary to kind of monitor and look over what was happening. I think that's very critical.
Absolutely. Wonderful. There are questions about like office chairs, and it's just things that we don't even think about on the daily basis. That being said, I know you have to kind of run a little early, and I apologize to everybody here. There are a lot of questions about the slide deck. So I apologize that they were not already attached to the itinerary, but we can provide that over to some of our IT folks and make sure that that is available for all of you folks. Mr. Newsom, again, thank you so much for your time with us here today. This has been a really great discussion, and we really just are looking forward to see what the future looks like.
Love to come back anytime and give some additional perspective whenever the time is right. We're continuing to learn. We're all continuing to learn. I think this is very exciting. It's unfortunate that what led to us to even having these conversations, but very excited. I think this is going to be transformative.